Can I do what?
You use that. That's the one that's connected to Zoom.
Oh, okay. Let's see if. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you all for coming today. I believe that this is our first in-person department lecture since February 2020. And I'm thrilled that the brilliant Jules Gill-Peterson is the speaker to reintroduce us to being physically as well as intellectually together again. Before I introduce Professor Gill-Peterson, I would like to begin with a couple of acknowledgments. First, I want to thank everyone who has helped arrange Professor Gill-Peterson's visit to us. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the English Department and the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program. And I'm grateful for the English Department's generous co-sponsorship and the careful planning of Paul St-Amour, Stephanie Palmer, Shauna Behemat, Gwendolyn Beetham, Maria Murphy, Nat Rivkin, and Ravel Sequeira, all of whom have made it possible for Dr. Gill-Peterson to be here to share her work. Second, in an effort to recognize both historical practices and ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, I want to acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania stands on the Lenape-Hoking Indigenous territory. I encourage everyone present today to look over the resources available through Natives at Penn and to consider signing their petition for Penn to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. In addition, like many in the English department and across campus, we in GSWS are working with Penn for Pilots, the staff and faculty group that is advocating for Penn, the largest private property owner in Philadelphia, to participate in a payment in lieu of taxes program. I hope that all Penn community members can read and consider signing the Pilots petition, which also seeks to redress the ongoing effects of histories of violence and displacement here in the city of Philadelphia. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Jules Gill-Peterson, who is Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Gill-Peterson's magisterial 2018 first book, Histories of the Transgender Child, won a Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction and the Children's Literature Association Book Award. The words with which she begins this book are particularly poignant and chilling now, as state legislatures have flagrantly sought to reverse what small gains have been made in trans children's rights by banning trans affirmative library books, prohibiting gender-affirming healthcare, and barring trans athletes from sports. As Professor Gill-Peterson wrote in the preface to Histories of the Transgender Child, if childhood is already a very dangerous time and space for children in the United States, trans childhoods, and so much more specifically and insistently, Black trans and trans of color childhoods, non-binary trans childhoods, low-income trans childhoods, disabled trans childhoods, and undocumented trans childhoods have been evacuated of formal meaning and abandoned by adults as less than human precincts, caustic reminders of the effects of a culture in which the delusional adoration of the rosy figure of the child abuts the most heinous quotidian modes of violence in the lives of real children. The 21st century framing of trans children is new and lacking historicity, Professor Gill-Peterson further argues, is actually complicit with children's ongoing political infantilization, particularly by medicine, and therefore the disproportionate harm done to trans children who can never live up to that idealized rosy figure of the child, always imagined as generically white, middle class, cisgendered, and asexual. Drawing on a century's worth of medical archival evidence, Histories of the Transgender Child establishes not just that trans children have a verifiable history, but also that their presumed gender plasticity was in fact central to the development and racialization of transgender medicine as such. As both editor of Transgender Studies Quarterly, the field's flagship journal, and a prolific writer, Professor Gill-Peterson continues to work at the cutting edge of gender and sexuality studies. Two recent instances are her contribution to a roundtable on thinking sex with trans studies now, published in a 2020 issue of Social Text, Left of Queer, edited by Jasbir Puar and our own David Ng, and an essay entitled Toward a Historiography of the Lesbian Transsexual, or the TERF's Nightmare, in the Journal of Lesbian Studies. In the former, she considers the ethical and theoretical affordances of, quote, a subjectless critique or a reading practice that is attuned to the opacity of transness in the past, its forms that cannot produce continuity with the present, but offer ways to outthink the emergencies and inertias that characterize the present world. In the latter, she postulates, quote, an anti-TERF method for reading the past that questions the enduring ahistorical fantasy of the always imperiled lesbian, and instead endeavors to think the historicity of trans people's sexualities, recognizing, quote, the incommensurability of sexuality and gender as enmeshed zones of trans experience, desire, and sociality that routinely transgress all systems of norms designed to discipline them. Professor Gill-Peterson is currently at work on a book project entitled A Trans History of DIY that reframes post-1945 transgender history by strategically foregrounding the medical archive, turning to the do-it-yourself to eliminate long, illegible trans histories at the margins of the social, without institutional medicine, legality, or state recognition. I could go on, but you're not here for me. So I'll rein in my enthusiasm now and get us to the main event. Professor Gill-Peterson's talk today is entitled The Queen's Two Bodies, or a Political Theology of Trans Femininity. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, let me pop this on. Thank you so much. That was a very moving introduction, and I'm so honored to be the first in-person lecturer. I very rarely am giving any in-person lectures, but it has happened once or twice this year that I've arrived somewhere to find out that I was, the first reason in a long time for people to get together. And I feel really happy about that. It fills me with energy and joy. I mean, I have learned how to own Zoom as best I can, but God, I love, to be standing up and talking. So that's just the way I am. So thank you for coming, but also thank you to those who are tuning in on Zoom. I'm very grateful that we have that opportunity. And, I really appreciate that introduction and the arc of it in particular, because some of what I'm trying to do in my work right now is wrestle the line between critique and actually taking on affirmative trans projects that I think are not only valuable right now, but impossibly long overdue. So this talk actually comes from the last chapter of a little book that interrupted my workflow. That one of those books that starts as a pile of anger and resentment and now is leading in interesting ways. And so this is a little kind of crossover book I'm calling A Short History of Trans Misogyny, which does precisely as it says. I love book titles that are just like, this is what the book is about. And so I want to try and experiment a little. I've never shared about 90% of this writing, and I think of it a little bit less as a critique, although it has critiques, less of a close reading, although it has tons of close reading. It's a little bit of a sermon, so let me see if I can do it for you, okay? So here we go. Okay, now here we go. In the faded, sun-stroked Los Angeles of the late 1950s, a lone wolf appears on the horizon of Pershing Square. This small public park in LA's notorious vice district of downtown is abuzz with the thick atmosphere of a newly setting June sun. As this man surveys the square city block before him, he inventories the ensemble cast gathered for their daily sundown rituals. In one corner, a Black woman is sweating in woolly taupe, preaching to exhaustion of sin and repentance. Within earshot of her, a clutch of street kids snicker and banter in grubby clothes, chewing on the ends of long finished smokes. A few stray commuters late for their streetcars trot through the square, eyes ever forward on their destinations. And on the opposite end of the park is a small makeshift shed on the side of which two policemen lean lazily but watchfully. Despite the flurry of activity, the soundscape of Pershing Square remains altogether muted, if not somehow dusky. Only to the trained eye of the solitary man now perched on the street corner is the subterranean life of the park detectable. Slim, wiry figures are camping out here and there, so casual in their tableau as to look effortless, propped up against benches, water fountains, and bushes. They could be waiting for a bus or a friend, suspicious only in their perfected casual innocence. Around them forms a ring, though at a noticeable distance, of much older figures, all men. Dressed more conventionally as if they had just left the office, they are caught in the strange paradox of looking so generically normal that they are out of place. They have come here to seek out someone like our lone wolf. They have come to find a young man in Pershing Square. Young man is the novelist John Recky's term of endearment for the masses of male hustlers that populated the vast American city of night of his eponymous 1963 novel. Stretching from Times Square on the East Coast to New Orleans on the Gulf and over to Pershing Square in the Californian West, Recky's work in this novel has, kind of long been lauded for its unflinching portrayal of the sexual underground before the Stonewall riots. City of Night is loosely autobiographical, following one such young man, a Chicano from the borderlands of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, who leaves his mother behind for the relentless, solitary life of a hustler. As an emblem of what the mid-century called trade, the protagonist isn't queer as the novel would understand it. Like countless other young, fit, and anonymous men and boys who filled the cities of LA, or filled cities like LA after World War II, his sexuality is economic, not an identity. He has sex with men exclusively for money, looking down on the queers in search of unpaid dates, relationships, and happily ever after. He's a drifter, moving from city to city with a beatnik wanderlust straight out of Kerouac, an irrepressible need to seek something he thinks he will never find. The balm for a lonely spirit in a soulless America. He arrives in LA and to Pershing Square anonymous, without a place to live or any plan other than doing what he knows best, which is to hustle. This young man is the famed gay outlaw. Long before the era of gay marriage and corporate pride parades, the embattled cities of post-war America generated the solo gay man as a kind of fugitive, always on the run from the cops and without anywhere to rest in the era of the suburbs, Leave It to Beaver, and meaningless office jobs in skyscraper buildings. The gay outlaw took his expulsion as a badge of honor. He was framed by a conservative public as a menace to society, a would-be sexual predator, or a dangerous criminal. And in the era, in the heavily policed era before Stonewall, the gay outlaw was a symbol of cool dissent, leaving behind the stultifying world of the 1950s and American normality. He may have been only as free as the change in his pocket from his most recent score, but his destiny was his own. If he could avoid the police, and if he could avoid the truth of his deep loneliness, he answered to no one. Or so many have long fantasized, both gay male cultural producers and, to some extent in received historical memory. I mean, what could be more antisocial than to be a male hustler, giving up family, regular work, and normal society for an illegal and furtive life, lived out in public parks, vice bars, and after-hours joints? What could be further from the idea of good gay community than an economy of cheap sex work and cheaper drugs? Weren't gay outlaws in the heavily closeted era of McCarthyism the ultimate self-made men, bravely choosing themselves over the death sentence of conformity? I think that story has long held its appeal to some, but it's actually not what happens to this young man. Not long after City of Night's protagonist arrives in Pershing Square, he is swept up by the arrival of the park's grande dame, a queen named Miss Destiny. Recchi paints a wild portrait of her, a sort of composite figure made of half-truths and spectacular lies. But he actually based her on a real queen he knew, and one who, had a cover story in one magazine in 1964. As a queen in the novel, Destiny is a kaleidoscope, much larger than life. One day she lays on a thick Southern accent, and the next day she's from Pennsylvania. One day she explains that she got her name Destiny from a rich daddy. But in her next breath, he was actually a poor truck driver. She claims nearly every piece of trade in LA is her ex-husband, but she dreams of settling down and getting married. A real wedding is what she wants, quote, like every young girl should have. One where she will descend a grand staircase in a Hollywood Hills house and where champagne and cake will be served after the ceremony. Miss Destiny is a street queen, a trans femme who gives Pershing Square its life and authenticity. Like Marsha P. Johnson on Christopher Street, thousands of miles away on the other coast of the country, Miss Destiny is the patron saint of this outpost in the gay underworld. She dazzles the young men who have flocked to LA to make it, taking them in and teaching them what it takes to survive, but also how to live larger than life itself. She is royalty in every sense. As a trans femme, she has two bodies, and she claims to transcend the material world, but she is also its lowly symbol, its stigmatized calling card. Miss Destiny reigns in Pershing Square, and it is in her image that the hopes and dreams of the gay world of City of Night will rise and fall. The hot, cramped, and overly peopled streets, dives, and apartments of downtown LA breathe in and out with a strange dialectic of a queen's exaltation and her inevitable fall from grace. As you can see, I'm a little interested in the idea that the gay world has had its queens, that trans femininity is forever entangled with gay men's urban life in the United States. And I think, for one thing, that some of the dilemmas, antagonisms, and schisms of the era Recchi documents are still with us, perhaps even more inflamed than they were then. Today, a trans woman and a gay man are seen as different species, one defined by that thing called gender identity, the other by sexuality as in orientation. We're asked to assemble under an acronym, a pretty tense one, barely held together by those letters LGBT, with its ritual combat every June when we're supposed to pay homage to how much the first three of those letters owe the last. But that revisionist history, that narrative that serves the rather base ends of US identity politics, has very little to say about queens. Queens are just metaphors, campy expressions, or relics of an era now apparently anachronistic, when gay men were apparently less sure of their distance from trans femininity. But I am less certain than ever that we should trust anything about that account. I don't think we're done with the problem of what I might call the essential trans femininity of gay culture. It's merely been remade time and time again since the era of Miss Destiny's reign over Pershing Square. Now, in academic sexuality studies, the drama might play out in sort of two acts. Now, in Act 1, queer theory determined that trans femininity was an allegory, not a viable way of life. And by reading trans femininity as an allegory for how gender is performative, or how queer irony that destabilizes identity positions is the best measure of political radicalism, early queer theory used trans femininity as its theory and sold out actual trans women as that theory's collateral damage. The most dramatic entry in this bibliography remains, no doubt, Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter, where Butler reads Jenny Livingston's popular 1990 documentary, Paris is Burning. Butler proposed that Paris is Burning depicts the limitations of subverting gender norms, the places where performance can rigidify oppressive power structures rather than soften them. And for the role of that failure, Butler cast Venus Extravaganza, a trans woman of color and one of the subjects of Livingston's documentary, who was murdered before the film's release. Butler pounced on Extravaganza's death as the primary evidence for their argument, which was, quote, Sometimes a fatally subversive appropriation takes place, end quote, instead of a politically queer one. And in Act 2, queer of color theory, followed closely, I think, by most of trans studies, has tried to reclaim and rescue these trans femmes of color and these street queens from their previous queer theoretical abjection, but they have done so by intensely idealizing her. So she appears this way, for example, in one of the foundational texts of queer of color studies, Rod Ferguson's Aberrations in Black, a book that you might recall opens with a scene of a, quote, black drag queen prostitute who is a passing figure from a scene in Marlon Riggs's 1989 art film, Tongues Untied. In a film that is a deeply important statement about Black gay men, Ferguson fixates on the one brief appearance of a trans femme. And this queen appears midway through the film. She doesn't have a speaking role. As she wanders public space and smokes a cigarette, an Essex Hemphill poem is read as the voiceover. And Ferguson values her appearance for what it figures, asking if queer of color critique, quote, what mode of analysis would be appropriate for interpreting the drag queen prostitute as an image that allegorizes and symbolizes that social heterogeneity, end quote, of Black life more broadly. And I think the words allegorize and symbolize are key here, although they appear with nearly almost the opposite significance that they might have held for Butler. Still, Aberrations in Black is not about what this Black trans femme knows or does with the situation of her life, but rather uses her as the precondition for critiquing racial capitalism and establishing intersectional queer studies. Once she has served her purpose in the few first pages of the book, she disappears altogether, much like we are led to believe might happen in the film. But my point is that in both acts in this very brief academic genealogy, what defines the poor street queen is that she primarily makes meaning for everyone who is not her. Her trans femininity and street life make meaning for artists and theorists alike, but no one asks a more obvious question that is at once historical and literary. What does it mean to be a queen? Why are queens so central to gay life in the second half of the 20th century? That's my question. What if the street queen is not a metaphor, an allegory, a theoretical prop, or a vehicle for intersectional idealization, but a name attached to a real socially consequential person in the cities of the mid-century and afterwards? What if the trans feminine street queen was, well, the real queen of the damn gay world? What sort of sovereignty is that? The answers to these questions, I am very happy to say, take us into some very bizarre and perhaps unexpected alliances between social science, history, and literature. And Endeavor, I think you'll see, is deeply sympathetic to Heather Love's writing about the three in her most recent book, Underdogs. And for my purposes, I'm going to triangulate three classics from each of those genres: Esther Newton's anthropological study, Mother Camp, with Recky's City of Night, and Ernest Kent Horowitz's 1950s study, The King's Two Bodies. And I'll thereby suggest that the street queen is more than a metaphor for a mere mortal or a sociological type, let alone a figure confined to gay literature. She is altogether more promising, more magical, and most worrisome of all, possibly tragic. That's my shtick, so here we go. Newton explains in Mother Camp that trans femininity symbolizes the social situation of the mid-century homosexual. She is the purest incarnation of the stigma of effeminacy that marks all gay people. The queen is the one who defies that cultural stigma by unflinchingly embracing that effeminacy. She is the only one who has made a career out of being gay. Yet Newton also observed that the queen does not so reign in an absolute or uncontested sense. Rather, her book is really attending to the deep class hierarchies within the gay world that make a major distinction between stage performers, AKA professional drag queens, and what are called street queens. Whereas the professional drag queen is lionized for her campy wit, her exaggerated glamour, and her self-aware, sometimes mocking performance, the street queen is generally reviled as the lowest of the low, what Newton terms the underclass of the gay world. Street impersonators, she writes, are never off stage. Their way of life is collective, illegal, and immediate. Its central experiences are confrontation, prostitution, and drug highs. So even in an underworld where everyone is to some extent a deviant and where everyone is to some extent criminalized, it is the sincere street queens who actually try to live as women who are punished for what is already being celebrated when it is performed as an act on stage, femininity. One drag queen Newton interviewed put it, I think, rather plainly. I think what you do in your bed is your business. What you do on the street is everybody's business. All right. Trans femmes made the rest of the gay world look bad by daring to go all the way with the stigma of effeminacy and actually become women. But as Newton notes, by the same token, she wasn't really surprised when she learned that the street girls had been the ones to lead the Stonewall riots. Street fairies, she wrote in the second preface to this book, have nothing to lose. Of course, Mother Camp is primarily a study of the stage queens, such that the street queens only appear in the text through their negation in the gay world. And so for that reason, their social scientific typology, I think, is one that we can track in much richer tones in the literary archive, which I want to argue Recchi, among other writers, actively shares with Newton. So I see a kind of common social scientific and literary project going on. Now, Miss Destiny appears in one chapter of City Night, and that chapter with which I open this talk might as well have been titled The Tragedy of Queen Destiny. Like Shakespeare's original title for The Tragedy of King Richard II, Recchi paints a portrait of a street queen who falls from the highest of stations to total ruin, betrayed by her subjects. The quiet narrator of City of Night, that young man who came to Pershing Square, faithfully chronicles her demise with a kind of ethnographic tenderness we might be tempted to read as basically a tragedy. He senses the end of her reign coming, but he can do nothing to prevent it. Now, Destiny is not just a street queen, but sees herself as the literal queen of this gay world. And if the word queen means more than just a metaphor, then Destiny's campy penchant for poorly quoting Shakespeare to everyone around her in downtown LA is our first clue. Destiny is a larger than life character, but Recchi wasn't inventing something that did not already exist in the real Los Angeles of his youth. Street queens lived something like literary lives in their mundane poverty. They practiced an art of living, forged in the combination of trans femininity's aesthetics and extreme material lack. Denied by her class access to any of the new transsexual technologies for changing sex, the street queen inherited the oldest lineage on this earth of trans femininity that long predates Western medicine. Hers was a spiritual vocation or an ascetic practice, a vocation in the magic of transubstantiation, changing one substance into another. This alchemy of sex was how one degraded form of flesh we call maleness could be promised to transform into a glamorous, exalted state of high femininity. So street queens weren't superficial in their female impersonation. As the ultimate mimics, their art of appearances contained a metaphysical promise that the professional drag queens of Mother Camp couldn't even dream of matching. The street queen would actually become a woman one day. She would become real. Her life held materially transformative promise. But strangely, becoming a woman created for the street queens a situation that shared a lot in common with the monarchs after which they were named. The street queen, in a trans feminine sense like a monarch, had two bodies. One was the earthly body into which she was born as a mortal male and thus pretty flawed. The second was a metaphysical body, the promised form of high femininity and womanhood to which she strived. Miss Destiny had received a divine messenger early in childhood to announce this dilemma. A fairy voice, a femme conscience named Miss Thing. So at a young age, Miss Thing explained that having two bodies was a kind of comedy of errors. Why, how ridiculous, Miss Thing reassured this frightened young trans child. That patah between your legs simply does not belong, dear. But that patah was not an intractable mark of failure or the proof that she could never be a girl. On the contrary, Miss Thing taught Destiny that it was a signal of her fate. She was destined for a higher calling. She would transcend the ridiculous and become a real girl. Now, the idea that a king or a queen has two bodies was the legal foundation of Elizabethan era monarchy in England, as we all know. Although the king was, I know, I just can't believe I'm talking about this in my career. It's like very far out of my wheelhouse. Although the king was a human being with a mortal body, he was understood to also possess a second body as ruler, which was called his body politic, right? We see here the famous frontispiece to the Leviathan. And this second body was metaphysical. It was meant to be a little bit angelic, more like a god than human. The king's body politic was not just infallible, but immortal. So the doctrine of the king's two bodies was a clever concept designed to ensure continuity in a dynasty. When the king died, only his mortal body died, his body natural. His body politic, however, lived on, investing itself in the natural body of the next person to assume the throne. And so in the classic study of this concept, the king's two bodies, Kantorowicz calls this the political theology of sovereignty. The king is not just a political ruler, but half divine. And his second body, that divine body politic, is obviously extremely strange from a logical point of view. And so in 16th century England, legal commentators claimed that the divine political body quite literally incorporated his subjects into him. In this way, the crown was said to hold the subjects of the king in trust in his name under the law, but also literally in his body. As a theological doctrine, the point was that the king was united as one in his body with his people. In his body politic, wrote one jurist, he is the head and they, the people, are the members. This spiritual and political union between king and people meant that all the mortals of the realm were uplifted into contact with the divine by being ruled. The divinity of the body politic uplifted all mortals, including the king's natural body. And incredibly, can't make this stuff up, people, the origin of this idea is an older Latin doctrine for deciding the sex of so-called hermaphrodites. If an individual's sex was in doubt in 14th century Italy, whichever sex appeared to predominate would be recognized by law, and that predominant sex was said to rule over the other and thus incorporated into the person. And thus, that was actually the analogy through which, one of the analogies through which the political body of the Tudor king was founded. As Kantorowicz puts it, what fitted the two sexes of an hermaphrodite fitted juristically also the two bodies of a king. Now, strange as it may seem, but you're all still here with me, so I'm going to tell you, Miss Destiny had all these trappings as a queen. In addition to having the trans feminine situation of two bodies, male and woman, she had to be crowned Miss Destiny. And this is a story she tells the narrator of City of Night at one point. So hers was not a literal crown, of course. Instead, to become a woman in the world, to be real, she had to be given her name by someone who recognized her as a woman. And so the fated name Destiny was bestowed on her in a kind of farcical coronation by a man named, of all things, you'll never believe it, Duke. So here's how she tells the story. After being kicked out of her home as a teenager, Miss Destiny had hitchhiked here to Philly. As soon as she arrived in the city, she bought, quote, a flaming red dress and high-heeled sequin shoes. Finally draped in the finery of femininity, she gloried in people taking her to be real for the first time in her life. She was finally being treated as a woman. And so it didn't take long for her to meet a rich daddy at a party. And this man, Duke, was fixated on her from across the room. He walked over to her with a singularity of focus. And this is how Destiny explains it. Why, he comes to me and says, just like that, you are my destiny. And she pauses the story here to explain that to the narrator that, quote, Well, I thought he had said, you are Miss Destiny, mistaking me, for some other girl. And worried that her new paramour might realize she wasn't a real woman if she didn't seize the opportunity, she fired back with barely a second thought. I am Miss Destiny. Only the Duke seemed to have misheard her now, thinking that she had said, I am his destiny. But the mistake played out in her favor, is when the hostess of the party came over and complimented her beauty, the Duke chimed in to confirm that she was indeed his destiny. And from then on, I am Miss Destiny, she concludes. She was coronated a queen by a Duke of Philadelphia. But the tenuous to her claim to realness, which originated in a pretty campy miscommunication, dramatizes the very real dangers of reigning as a street queen. Incorporating two bodies is a high stakes fate for Miss Destiny, as she quickly learns when Duke abandons her not long after they fall in love. She moves to Washington, D.C. and returns to street sex work to survive. And she tells the young man listening to her life story that she would always tell her Johns that she was on her period to avoid being found out. But if she were ever clocked, and she often was, violence at the hands of men was never far behind. And worse, as this young man chronicles in this chapter, the highest of queens like Destiny seemed given to the lowest of extravagant depressions. This is because their realness, their feminine sovereignty, is never secure on this earth. Like a paranoid king straight out of Shakespeare expecting betrayal at the hands of someone in his court, so too the queen constantly fears being clocked, even in the gay world, and brought back down to earth from the high station of realness. So one night at Destiny's shoddy apartment, as a group of queens entertain a group of pretty rough men, everyone's manically taking pills, smoking weed, and downing liquor, as was the custom in 1958, Destiny falls apart. Feeling lonely, paranoid, and unadmired by her subjects, she begins to lash out at them. I don't know what I am doing here amongst all this trash, she screams at her court. I went to college and read Shakespeare. The queen is clearly highly conscious of the tragic fates of so many Shakespearean rulers, where the affliction of two bodies can strike at any time, transforming the monarch into the all-too-human fool. Betrayal is the only constant in Shakespeare's tragedies, and Miss Destiny's depression feels like that reversal, being betrayed by her subjects' lack of devotion. Worst of all, none of these poor young men or queens even get the literary reference, except it turns out for the narrator who tells her that he has read Shakespeare. And this interrupts Miss Destiny's depression for a moment. But trained by a hard life to be suspicious, she tests him by asking if he knows who Desdemona is, the tragic woman of the Tempest. And he replies, yes, he knows Desdemona's tragic tale. And the narrator feels something shift in the air in that moment. Something, quote, something was released inside Miss Destiny and something established between us through that Shakespearean reference. But it's a strange something, quote, yearned for with others from person to person in this locked world. Something like the promise of real love. A love that would treat Miss Destiny as a real woman, one that has tormented her in its absence her whole life. Without it, she has felt only, quote, the loneliness churning beneath the gay facade, desperately awake every moment, shouting to be spoken and therefore shared. Miss Destiny lives as a tragic Desdemona in LA, hoping for the love of a man, but worried he will betray her, revealing her queen's body to be nothing but a degraded mortal's, a mere man. Queens are fooled more often than they admit, observes the narrator solemnly. As powerful as the street queen's promise of turning a man's body into a woman's might be, that brush with the divine is always haunted by the threat of its reversal in a cruel world that would revolt by clocking its queen. Destiny's resulting depression makes her a tragic figure, one destined perhaps to fall into hell instead of ruling the gay world as its queen. Maybe, but then again, maybe not. Here comes the close reading part. The peculiar dilemma of trans femininity, having two bodies actually, I think, keeps the story narratively and formally ambiguous. And Miss Destiny wields that ambiguity in Reki's hands better than any. Once she's done sitting in judgment of her court, she shifts the scale of her speech. She tells them that sometimes, quote, when I'm very high and maybe sitting at one of the bars in the neighborhood, quote, I imagine that an angel suddenly appears. This angel has come, of course, to signal Judgment Day, in the gay world at least. And the angel says, all right, boys and girls, this is it. The world is ending, and heaven and hell will be to spend eternity just as you are now, in the same place, among the same people, forever. Obviously, for Destiny, that's not a good gamble. For the gay life has been a miserable one for all of them, exiled and discarded as the deviants of America, but the risk of the angel's game is highest for her. If she stays for eternity in Pershing Square, she will never resolve the dilemma of her two bodies. She will never succeed in her quest for transubstantiation. Her fate has been since a young age to transcend the mortal world, to become angelic herself by becoming a beautiful, real woman. But she can't become real for good if she is forced to live in limbo forever as a street queen. Heaven, the angel's announcement, is not. Though it is a kind of hell, perhaps it's better read as a purgatory, where transmisogyny and poverty would rule her existence forever. And so knowing this, Destiny tries to run away from the angel in her vision. But I can't run fast enough from the evil angel, she says. He sees me and stops me, and I'm caught. The reign of the queen has played out its fate as Shakespearean tragedy, because realness isn't really under her sovereignty, but belongs to the judgment of an evil world. There will be no escape for Miss Destiny. Miss Destiny's tragedy is a seductive parable for what really happened to street queens. As Esther Newton observed in the second preface to Mother Camp, and Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson experienced firsthand in the early 1970s, the gay world really did betray its queens in the wake of Stonewall. And it was first and foremost a political betrayal, selling out the queens for a new gender normative vision of gay that was taking off in the 1970s and was much more masculine. But given the spiritual importance of the street queen's two bodies, I contend it was also a spiritual betrayal of queendom. Miss Destiny's fate was seemingly written in advance, leaving the narrator of City of Night to watch on helplessly as the evil angel's prophecy came to pass. He could do no more than offer her the image of Desdemona in solidarity. But the better reference would still be Richard II, which tells the story of the king falling into the depths of human corruption precisely because he has a man's body attached to his divine body, making him vulnerable to being deposed. Miss Destiny seems to suffer the same fate, replaced by the masculine gay men on the horizon. So too for Sylvia and Marsha, kicked out of the gay movement they had put their lives on the line for. The problem with tragedy, however, and here, watch me put my historian's hat on, is that it lets the real culprits off the hook by casting the queen's fall from grace as foretold by the fates. The evil angel is a symbol of judgment, sure, but in truth, he's merely the mouthpiece for the massive oppression trans femmes face. What's holding back Miss Destiny from being real, from being happy and living as a woman, isn't divine judgment. It's the mundane world she lives in. 1950s America treats her as unreal and undeserving of anything other than a criminal existence in the underworld. And so too a bunch of right-wing politicians today. That she has made of her situation in life something worthy of the title queen testifies to her tenacious magic. But in the end, the street queen cannot transubstantiate without a world that believes in her magic. She may know herself to be real, but if no one around her believes it, and if men keep beating her, the police keep arresting her, and the medical establishment keeps hormones out of reach, her exalted femininity won't matter enough. The art of appearance, the work of the queen cannot be made real without a political change in the world. If her gay subjects abandon her to the judgment of a cruel world, even the queen cannot rise above that sin. Tragedy, that very Christian narrative of the predestined fall from grace, creates a difficult situation. Tragedy can only be remedied by redemption. as when Christ, who bore the cross of the human world of sin, comes again. And indeed, the idealization of street queens today has that messianic quality to it. If only we celebrate Saint Sylvia and Saint Marcia properly, the second coming of the trans woman of color of Stonewall will redeem us all. Our politics will be saved by invoking trans women of color, acting in their name. We will rescue them from their betrayal in the 1970s by lifting them up as goddesses. Or so we're told. At its root, the redemption of tragedy requires waiting for the creation of a new world, a heaven on earth, which is sometimes called queer utopia. But the street queen's most urgent cry was not to wait. When she rose in defiance in the many riots she led, from Cooper's Donuts to Compton's cafeteria to Stonewall, she urged us to fight now. Here on this earth, her aim was to transform what is already here, instead of hoping that one day we will all be redeemed. Her two bodies were meant to bring the divine down from the heavens and into contact with the poorest neighborhoods in America. Wisely then, and here I'm taking us towards the ending, Recky couldn't bring himself to finish Miss Destiny's story. He leaves the ending pretty open in City of Night. Destiny does not accept the judgment of that evil angel who brings about Judgment Day from a derelict gay bar in downtown Los Angeles. Her speech ends with a far more dramatic upheaval. She indicts God for his inadequacy in the face of her trans feminine majesty. There is a God, she tells the young men and queens in her apartment, and he is one hell of a joker. Instead of accepting his judgment that she isn't real or that she should live out the rest of her life in Pershing Square as it is, she announces the ultimate riot. I'm going to storm heaven in protest. Here I am. Unafraid, she is ready to scream in God's face, who could be no worse, let's be honest, than any cop or John who had threatened her a million times already. And God will cringe, she tells everyone. Recky's chapter about Miss Destiny is not titled The Tragedy of Queen Destiny, after all. It is titled Miss Destiny, The Fabulous Wedding. And it ends not with Judgment Day, but a sort of anti-ending, which is what I will offer you. The narrator leaves LA for a while, and then when he comes back to Pershing Square, he finds that Destiny has disappeared. No one knows where she went or what happened to her. So he asks around, and the consensus seems to be that she had her dream wedding and then vanished without a trace. No one knows what happened to her because no one showed up at her wedding. The queen's subjects abandoned her in her moment of glory. So everyone tells the narrator a story that is as equally true as it is surely false. Here are my last three impressions of mid-century speakers. Chuck claims first that Destiny had the very wedding she dreamed of, although he wasn't there. She had it out in Hollywood, man, in this real fine pad. And I heard she actually dressed like a bride, man. But Pauline tells it differently. Well, she had her wedding all right. She didn't invite me, but I heard, and it was horrible. Apparently, Destiny tripped and fell down the winding staircase of the Hollywood mansion in her wedding dress. Then the place was raided by the vice squad, and that's where Miss Destiny, the college co-ed, is now, busted in the joint again for masquerading. Pauline asks the narrator to imagine the awful juxtaposition. Miss Destiny in bridal drag sitting crying in the paddy wagon on her wedding day. But Trudy disagrees with Chuck and Pauline, claiming that Destiny is only gone because she's living happily, quote, in Beverly Hills with the man who sponsored the wedding. Except Trudy didn't attend the wedding either, afraid of a police raid, so she doesn't really know. Chuck supplies a final possibility that the wedding had an entirely opposite meaning. He says he heard that Destiny's court-ordered psychiatrist from her last arrest finally succeeded in turning her back into a man who married a real woman. The narrator then watches as Chuck quote, pushed his wide hat over his eyes. Whoops. Let's go back. There we go. As Chuck pushed his wide hat over his eyes, as if to block the sudden vision of a world in which such crazy things can happen. Now, the narrator doesn't believe any of these stories of Miss Destiny's wedding, and that is precisely why Recky's account of the Queen's reign and fall is not a tragedy. It's more like an instruction. Keep the faith, but don't give up on the political struggle on which it depends. Perhaps he was reminding the gay world that if its people do not show up for their queens, they will ultimately be deprived of their power. Perhaps Recky knew that the Queen was the one who understood best the stakes of trans femininity as a political and spiritual force in the world. In her transubstantiation, the Queen held the metaphysical key to the alchemy it would take, not just to transition, but to lead a movement out of the policing, poverty, and immiseration of their gay lives at the hands of a cruel American society. In being the only one willing to storm heaven and spit in God's face, this destiny wielded a power that would eventually be abandoned in the aftermath of Stonewall, but it wasn't destined to fail, as if it were a Shakespearean tragedy. Things could always work out differently if only her subjects have her back. The Street Queen's lesson then concerns what it takes to build a genuinely trans feminist political and spiritual movement. One that doesn't rely on the fantasy of redemption, letting everyone off the hook for the problems of this world by waiting for a second coming of queer utopia. The Queen knows the immense risk and transformative reward of standing for femininity in this world, that you have to take on whoever is holding you back from your divine birthright, whether it be a police officer, middle-class gay activist, or God himself. Perhaps Recky foresaw that the Street Queen's crown could still be held in trust despite Destiny's disappearance by whoever was brave enough to claim femininity as political and spiritual power on its own terms. Perhaps he knew that the line between gay men and trans women isn't worth policing. Looking back at this period for guidance on today's frictions and struggles, what strikes me honestly isn't that it's hard, though it's obviously not easy either, to draw lines between a gay man and a trans woman. What stands out to me as far more important is that gay men and trans femmes had a shared material precarity, a shared vulnerability that they did not bear evenly, but thrust them into the same world. The titular city of night. There they eked out a living and plotted their fight back by crowning the Queen as the dual symbol of being set free on the one hand and falling into the seventh circle of hell on the other. The preservation of that incredibly difficult dialectic, that profound entanglement of homosexuality and trans femininity through the stigma and power of effeminacy suggests at a bare minimum that what we are owed today, as in the 1950s, is simply to struggle together. To live up to the Street Queens, not because they were tragic figures or perfect goddesses, but precisely because they had to actually live under the extreme weight of carrying the tension between material poverty and grandiose exaltation, between making it and hitting rock bottom, between freedom and self-destruction. Heavy is the head that wears the crown indeed, but if I am right about the function of the Queen, then her body is most importantly incorporated as ours collectively. We all bear the burden and the responsibility and the pleasure and promise of gay life together. Thank you so much. Well, now that we're warmed up.
So we have about 30 minutes for questions and all right.
Should I close the PowerPoint for the Zoom purposes too? Yeah. Okay. Aha, lovely. Okay. take a minute to digest also. Yes.
Thank you so much for this great talk. I loved it. As somebody who does very modern literature, so I was just like jumping out of my chair the whole time. And I'm so excited about this reconnection that you're making with the bodies. And it reminded me of this thing in Renaissance culture in England where queen was enslaved.
Yes.
Yes, for sex work.
For hussy,
right? And I
yeah.
always kind of wondered about that irony. And you really brought out for me how it's about the sovereignty of the subject, right? And how the sovereign doesn't work, subject does work. And that's kind of like the irony between those two subjectivities, I guess.
Yes.
And so it's not so much a question as an invitation to talk a little bit more about like the role of irony in comedy and kind of romance, because in the novel it seems like it's really ending as a romance or a comedy, it ends in marriage, right?
Yeah.
Even though there's like this specter of death there.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, and it's a very fun kind of romance because the narrator, who's trade. I mean, sometimes he sleeps with women, but it's mostly just to prove a point to other men, right? It's not very romantic, or it is between men. But he really kind of ends on this like, he cared about Miss Destiny, right? I mean, he has a romance with her, and I think that that's sort of beautiful in its interesting unconventionality. And I think, yes, I should say the etymology of queen. I mean, all of this, I'm relieved. I'm always afraid early modernists are going to be like, honey, what are you talking about, right? Because this is not my field. But, queen, of course, it's the spelling Quean, right? Which has that meaning of a hussy or a noblewoman and a prostitute sort of, cometh together, so to speak, right? And I love it because it lets you make all of these sorts of ironic plays. But what I think is so interesting, right? Like that, like, oh, sex workers make the world go round. They're the real ones in charge or whatever, right? Women's work makes the world, I mean, again, it's like there's some Sylvia Federici, kind of resonances coming through here. Yes, yes. But what's so weird, right, is that, what Newton points out in the 1960s, looking at the division in the gay world, is there's a division between irony and sincerity, right? So there's a pulling apart of these two modes, and irony comes to be the one that is much more devalued, or excuse me, much more valued. And sincerity, realness, being a woman is just seen as a trashy choice. Why? Because, well, we don't live in a Western culture doesn't like women, right? But there's something really interesting to me at the level of genre and history, etymology, genealogy, aesthetically, formally, about trying to think about what happens when you hold irony and sincerity really tightly together, right? This is why I'm very frustrated with how ballroom has been treated in a scholarly sense in general, with the exception of by Black scholars who, sometimes are participants in it. Most ballroom has been read as expressive, as symbolic, ornamental, as ironic. And I'm like, there's nothing ironic, like it is both. It's incredibly sincere. Realness is not, right? Realness is often punished, or even Butler singles out the phrase transubstantiation as the name for Venus Extravaganza's improper fantasy of being a woman, right? But my point is we don't have to pick one or the other. What's really interesting is when they're stuck together. And that cleaving apart to me is about so many things, right? It's a class story. It's a story of the struggle of, this story of the history of sexuality in modern capitalism. It's something that big, but it's also the story of gay men and trans women falling out. It's a story of the category woman being ripped apart by class and race, a problem we're seeing so resurgent today. Well, never ended, but so yes, right? I mean, I just want to think about, and where I'm going with this is like, what to call that, right? What is the alchemy that holds irony and sincerity so tightly together that they do something that is so generally looked down upon? Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm gleeful that it resonated for you, so thank you. Yeah. Oh, so many questions. Well, I feel like your hand was up first, so I've tried, yeah, to go for it.
Thank you so much for the section on which talk. And so I have one that city
Yeah.
talk is associated with very to read it. I wanted to ask about the other figures
Yes.
that you kind of orchestrated with the talk alongside his destiny. So we have
Yes.
Venus Extravaganza, the unnamed figure in
Yes. Yes.
And I'm curious how you put race in the kind of
Yes.
angle so unity,
Yeah.
and I think about the Butler essay on gender, so that there's also the essay.
Yes.
And specifically talking about ideas and stuff.
Mhm.
The way solutions does not critique but reifies.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So how race.
Yeah.
differs.
Thank you for that. Yeah, in the longer chapter, this is sort of the preoccupation that I couldn't quite figure out how to thread. You know, in some ways, Miss Destiny is the exception to the rule. I think most street queens, those quote unquote lowest class street queens are always racialized for the most part, maybe 99% of the cases, right? The first street queen in Mother Camp is named Lola, and she's a Black queen who's on hormones, and she cannot get any job anymore. She's been completely excommunicated from the gay world that she lives in Kansas City, because being Black and trans feminine is so disqualifying. She suffered what, you know, in a kind of Goffmanian registry would be like, you know, the total devastating loss of all status, right? Her identity has been so spoiled by her community. And that's what I think is interesting, right? Is that race and class are, you know, they're working, you know, in tandem, but not always in identical ways, right? So this Destiny is white, but, you know, her very, very low class status is what keeps her in the street queen category. But, you know, I think predominantly street queens are also understood after 1970 in an increasingly racialized way. And part of this has to do with the aftermath of Stonewall and the ascendancy of a gender normative gay and lesbian movement, right? Which, you know, where gender normativity is tied to middle class white American standards, or at least that is the model, right? And, you know, Newton points out in her second preface to Mother Camp that she's like, yes, this new masculine style of the 70s, she says, is correlate to maleness, middle classness, and whiteness. And she says, I mean, she's a white scholar saying this, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But she's like, I suspect, you know, that Black and, you know, brown, you know, gay bar communities have yet to sort of fully masculinize in this kind of way because they are being denied access to white manhood and white womanhood anyways, right? And so there is a kind of complicated story, I think, that needs to be told. But I would almost put it this way, that I think, you know, the further we get into the 20th century, the more intensely racialized the figure of trans femininity outside of its narrow medical kind of diagnosis is, right? And so the transsexual is not coincidentally a white woman, right? The transsexual like has to be a white woman in the figure of Christine Jorgensen and onward. And now today, right, you know, it's like, you know, to make Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson respectable, you have to throw away the words they used to describe themselves, which were drag queens and transvestites, right? And so they've been rehabilitated as transgender women of color, which is just like, you know, not to be rude, but it is quite literally an invention, right? It's not a language they would have ever used. And I think there's something about that too, in the way that, and interestingly enough today, transsexuals and transvestites have this connotation of being backwards, right? They're very anachronistic subjects, far more associated with racialized communities in the global north, but also just with the global south. They are literally seen as unmodern, right? And that's a complicated racial history of gender transitivity that's taking place over the 20th century, but obviously has roots that go centuries back, right? And I'm very interested in that. You know, that's sort of a terrible answer to your question because I'm gesturing to a sort of galaxy of things that I think matters, but trans femininity to me, right, in the larger book project, I'll say, is I understand it to be in the modern era, which I'm dating as, you know, in the mid 19th century onward, a racialized labor category. It's primarily a labor category of sex workers. And not only are they disproportionately racialized in the metropoles about which we know something in scholarship, New York, London, Berlin, it's also happening in colonial vice districts around the world. This is also a story about the British project to exterminate hijras in northwestern India. It's also a story about the regulation of sex work in a number of places, Indonesia, Hawaii, you know, Puerto Rico, I mean, like kind of all over, and it's not a coincidence to me. So part of what I'm interested in is also how trans femininity as such is a colonial category. It brings together groups of people under the violent rubric of colonial or white men's access to sex work in a colonial economy that otherwise wouldn't necessarily have had any reason to be grouped together because they wouldn't have understood themselves to be necessarily trans subjects as in people who are born one way and lived another, right? So that's part of the larger sort of scaffold, which is maybe the least detectable in this chapter because this chapter is about the US. But yeah, but I hope that, you know, offers some scaffolding. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah.
Sorry, Jonathan, can you use this, please?
Oh, sure.
Ah, fabulous.
I just really wanted to, first thing, thank you. It was a fabulous talk, but I wanted to explore, in some sense, the other side of the pathos that you so eloquently described. In specific terms, I'm sort of thinking about the notion of queenly violence, queenly anger.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about Andy Warhol's depictions of street queens in Bike Boy, where they go off and destroy a room, all the way up to, I was in San Francisco in the 1980s, and a group of street queens beat the shit out of a Golden Gloves Award winner. And he was quoted in the newspaper as saying that he's never gonna pick on a street queen again
Yeah.
because those bitches can really hurt, right? And so
Yeah.
what I'm trying to sort of get at, therefore, is to what extent is this gendered,
Yeah.
number one?
Yeah.
And furthermore, to what extent is this an opportunity for political agency?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's a beautiful question. Or rather a question that Terry's beauty and its antithesis together. I mean, this is precisely part of what I'm interested in, is what we're given, right? By refusing to idealize things that are just so clearly not ideal, right? Almost every commentator on the mid-century will have a line like this too, especially if they're men, right? Like often like those bitches are really da-da-da-da-da, right? Like street queens are very combative, right? I mean, Newton is, you know, writing as a closeted lesbian, so it's like you got to really read her very closely, but like she's not wrong, right? The queens were about the only ones who would beat up cops, right? And she has this amazing line in the second preface to the book in 1978, and she's like, you know, when the cops show up, you know, the boys in leather will just stand meekly in the corner and hand over their driver's licenses, and the queens will punch the cops in the face and throw drinks at them. And it's true, right? And there's been this tendency to latch onto that in very romantic terms and say, like, look, it's fighting back, it's bashing back. And sure it is. But, you know, I think if we stopped and if we could ask any of those queens, I doubt that was the favorite part of their life, right? It was very dangerous, extremely dangerous, right? And so I think what I'm interested in, right, is again, that these two things are tied so tightly. It's a strange form of gendered, it's just, it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? If you fight back, well, you must really be a man, right? And if you don't fight back, it's because you're a sissy. So it's not really a winning combination, right? But I think what's interesting is if we don't see that violence as redemptive, then what is it for, right? Some of it is just survival, right? But I don't think what queens are fighting for is survival, right? I think survival is a pretty poor horizon for politics, right? It's like, I would like to do more than live instead of die. It is to live well. It is to build a life worth living, right? And I think a life worth living is a life that is not defined by violence, whether violence that one has to commit to stay alive or receiving and enduring violence, right? Like, you know, you got me in an anecdote-y kind of mood, but, you know, I'll never forget for the 50th anniversary of Pride, I went to, and you're never going to believe this, an event sponsored by Airbnb in New York, where Airbnb, absolute fools, hired a bunch of people who were at Stonewall thinking, oh, this will be great. They'll come, they'll tell nice stories, right, about how, you know, the polite riot of Stonewall. These people, so smart. Yeah, they all show up, these Stonewall veterans. I'm sure they already cashed their checks and they're like, all right, give me the microphone. Let me tell you about how I chased cops around the village and beat the shit. Like telling a long story about running with Sylvia, grabbing the lids of garbage cans and clapping policemen's heads in between. Right? And I was watching the Airbnb people, you know, just blood draining. And I think it's good to laugh at it too, but the audience, right, was a little like, oh yeah, right? And I was sitting there being like, yeah, I mean, like, that's what you do if you have to, but like, that's not the goal, right? Like, you know, and that's why I'm so interested in these spiritual kinds of elements, right? That like living a life that is better than what you have right now should be a life defined by less violence. And there is a strain, I think, particularly of Black trans feminist thought that is about violence, about reducing violence, right? I mean, like, you know, biopolitical regulation of populations in part normalizes violence that wears people out and kills them much earlier than they would otherwise die. And so reducing violence, I think, in part means reducing that aggressive moment, right? But I think there's a story to be told about what comes after throwing shade, right? Like actual, especially intra-femme aggression, the way that, you know, that girls might talk about that, queens might talk about that between themselves, right? There are intramural discourses about this that people do not want to touch. And I think it's because it's very uncomfortable. And it's so inappropriate for women to be that violent, right? I mean, it's really kind of fascinating. So I'm you know, I don't have much more to say about it at the moment, but I really think, you know, again, like we get so much out of going into these places that we have been sort of coached to react to through very kind of narrow terms. Yes, amazing question. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gwendolyn. Already bashed my elbow, nearly jumping out of my seat with enthusiasm, hearing Sylvia Federici.
I mean, that's the kind of feedback I'm looking for, so thank you.
And then again, with racialized labor categories, my personal field of interest. So as I'm thinking with the other, somebody else mentioned something that you responded to. It was the first question that I was going to tag onto a little bit and offer a thought about how possibly work and labor and the work of ruling, the work of organizing, the work of making meaningful life. Like there's been some cool work done by folks working with refugees and refugee workers about how those who are confined to and live limited lives according to the racialized labor categories that they find themselves inhabiting, how not in that sort of like very tired Jim Scott weapons of the week shit, but like are doing the work of making their own lives meaningful. And I think that that pairs well with, in a way that doesn't necessarily have to reduce everything to labor, which is problematic because we're not living our lives to be workers. We're living our lives to be in relation. And but it really strikes me the way that you're so skillfully attending to work and meaning. And I think that that could be a thread that you could pull through more if you're interested in exploring that question more of what is the alchemy. I see work, but that's what I see everywhere.
No, I think you're right. Thank you so much. I really take that to heart. And, you know, it's sort of the broader interest that I have, right? I'm not interested in like what makes someone a trans woman, where that like, blah, 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 whatever. It's not an interesting question to me. I think it's actually a very bad question, often very dangerous question to ask for stupid political reasons, right? I'm interested in what are the social historical conditions of possibility for people to live lives that are recognized as trans feminine, which is a far less elegant way of putting it, but or a much more wordy way, right? But and here's where Federici, also Chris Chitty's work has been really provocative to me, right? It's like, you know, it is work, like it's labor. It's also, hello, it's unpaid labor, right? I don't know who, I'm not hello to you, but hello to like the, you know, it's work for which the dolls are not paid very well, right? But why? Because a trans feminine life is a life in which you have been ejected out of the formal economy, right? And I think about this both in local terms, right? If you are going to suffer what we might call, again, in a social scientific idiom, the loss of status, that is giving up being read as a man in the world, well, shit, what are your choices, right? You can't get married. And so really, basically, your only option is, until extremely recently, although I mean, yeah, whatever, I'm hyper conscious of that as a trans woman with a weird job being a professor. The only other job is sex work. That's where women who have no other choice because they can't get by in marriage are forced into that work, right? Or domestic labor or some other service economy, right? Similarly, in the colonial context, colonial powers come in, and before they outlaw sodomy, what are they always trying to pass laws about first? Marriage as in coverture. They're trying to force colonized people to adopt Western marriage customs, right? And that, I suspect, is part of why trans femininity is forced on people who had different cultures and languages and systems of organizing, often, living quote unquote trans lives in highly normal, traditional, scripted worlds, right? But they're pushed out and they are proletarianized, right? In this kind of, I think they fit into the narrative that Federici tells. And so I think in that sense, it's both true on a long scale, right? Very interested in when that becomes a problem, both in the United States and around the world, and I'm interested in some of the, it's like John D'Amelio's, oldie but a goodie essay, Capitalism and Gay Identity, asks this really interesting Marxian question about contradiction, right? Well, what if the proletarianization of the masses is ironically in part what makes possible a gay life, because it puts a bunch of men in a city together, roaming around, right? Well, and some of those men are girls. I mean, like, that's really interesting to me, right? I mean, it's just a different, and then with that framework, what if we then come to ballroom and ballroom's choreography of labor and work, right? Which again is not just ironic, it's not metaphorical, it's also very sincere, right? So that was just me very enthusiastically agreeing with you. But yeah, I think it's all about work. I think that's really, really, really the crux of it. Yes. Oh, okay, well then we'll go back.
Sorry.
I mean, I'll make sure I get to everyone, so.
Thank you.
So I'm like this in my own classroom too, where I'm like, whatever hand I'm just happening to look at right now. So yeah, sorry about the
Thank you.
aleatory nature.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. When you this talk kind of opened, like before you got into the main subject, you talked about how you wanted to talk about, this idea of like trans lesbianism being a tough was nightmare. Like this subsequent direction in which you took it is not where I thought you would go. But sort of juxtaposing this story with that sort of this opening, like it makes me think about how I mean, like Sedgwick theorized, this dichotomy between the model of transitivity and the model of separatism, and how I think Sedgwick kind of implied that the separatist model was more like a concern with respectability politics and stuff like that. The transitive model was more like subversive. I mean, I think that in many ways the symbolic stakes have changed a lot since then. Sure. But your talk made me think about how in many ways like transness sort of becomes the locus in which we try to make sense of, what is transitivity and what is separatism in queerness. And part of that is this, tension between two very different ideas of trans feminine communities. So on one hand, you have this sort of transitivity of trans people as bridging like male and female social worlds almost, and the other hand you have like Andrea Longtrue's idea of the trans separatist, who is so separatist that you've even like excommunicated a man within yourself. And so I'm just kind of curious how you see this idea of like transitivity and separatism existing, and this almost makes me wonder if there's a two-body metaphor to be made here between having both a transitive body and separatist body at the same time.
Well, that's a rock star question. Thank you. I may not be able to do it justice on the spot, but let me say a couple of things, right? And when you were introducing me and you went into my very sassy lesbian transsexual essay, I was like, oh, this is kind of perfect actually, because one of the points I want to make, right, is that one of the functions of trans femininity, specifically trans femininity, is that it's so profoundly relational. It does so much work for almost every other social category out there, right? So this is the larger arc of the book. Straight men buy sex from the Goyles, cheat on their wives and girlfriends with them, watch them in porn, and then when they have a crisis of masculinity because of it, trans panic allows them to lash out in violence or even kill them and be let off the hook, right? Cis women, some of them who tend to be white and middle class and come from glorious old empires like the British one, cannot stand to have anything in common with these other women and will do anything to sever their common precarity under, that is differentially distributed, right? It's kind of this like, well, actually would rather cut off that part of the category, right? We don't want to be with it, right? But then gay men and lesbians have this trouble too, right? Both actually in relation to trans femininity, the essay about lesbians is about how oddly invisible transsexual lesbians are in the era before the 1970s, before the so-called schism, right, of TERFs, or it's just like, if you go do any historical archival work, it's like, okay, well, all these people seem to be girlfriends. I'm not sure why that word is never being used. It's actually like very interesting, right? And here, gay men, right? So it does seem that like one of the registers of trans femininity is this intense transitivity, right? It's very deeply anxiety inducing for almost every other gendered position in the system, such that almost all of them feel very entitled to do a trans misogyny, right? They feel entitled to cash in on violence, to reassert a boundary, and to create a kind of, negative separatism, right? But I think it's quite interesting that I just don't think, I don't think trans people have ever been that into separatism. I mean, I don't know if it's just because like, if you gotta like figure out how to like live differently than what you were told you were as a kid, separateness just seems like a hilarious luxury. I don't know. But I have yet to see a kind of separatist politics. I mean, maybe tiny little snippets here and there, but it was never like a whole moment, right? Whereas there have been gay and lesbian separatist moments. And so that's kind of interesting because we often think of sexuality as the most relational domain, right? Like I'm one of those old school, trained by Freud enough to believe like, well, anyone can have sex with anyone. That's boring. I don't care. Like whatever, right? There's no like, But gender is actually taken to be much more real by people, right? Much more fundamental and ontological. When in reality, I think what trans femininity tells us is that it's not, it's a lot more transitive, but it's not always transitive within yourself, right? I mean, that's what I think is so interesting. As one of the many trans women who used to be at a certain moment, rather sincerely, at least I thought, a gay man, right? It's like, well, stranger things have happened, right? But we don't really like that. It's very uncomfortable for us to talk about, but it actually seems like an interesting historical significance of trans femininity as such, which is very interesting because it is the most policed version, right? Whereas trans masculinity, I just think has a different history that doesn't actually until like 2 minutes ago overlap with trans women, right? But for a lot of trans masculine people, you can drift into several intermediary socially recognized categories, however policed, right? For example, butch, right? You don't have to become a man, right? But for like sissy kids, right? There's not much. So you're here, and then if you want to go all the way, you got to go all the way, honey. But it's real dangerous, right? And so I think, yes, like I'm not sure I answered your question per se, but I think we have so much to figure out about what even those excellent concepts that Sedgwick left us with mean in other contexts than in which the one that she brought them to us. So just a fabulous, beautiful, beautiful question. Okay. Conscious of time, so I'll should we hear?
One more
Okay.
question, and then there's a reception after this.
Oh, good. Okay. You can come talk to me. Oh yeah, well these are flu bugs, yeah. From Vancouver, like me. So,
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to kind of build on this last point.
Yeah.
My research focuses on identity-based support systems like chosen families for queer and trans young people.
yes.
And a lot of what I've found is like kind of agreeing with that lack of need for separatism.
Yeah.
And yet there is so much, I imagine some people in here have read Detransition Baby. And there's this like stunning section that talks about these adolescent elephants who basically turned on themselves and each other because they lacked mentors and elders.
Yeah.
And so when I think about chosen family and I think about the vast just missing generations, especially for trans women, especially for sex workers, and that's precisely who is my community and who I support and try to do so with my research. I'm curious, like how you see some of that separatism, whether it's about labor, whether it's about sex worker movements, whether it's about looking at historical lineages, how we can create not only an intellectual lineage or genealogy, but also one of kind of hope and affirmation, because that's something you spoke about in the very beginning, and how you see, Miss Destiny as a queer elder almost, if at all.
It's the perfect last question, so thank you for that. And, you know, I said at the beginning that I think of this work as somewhat like a sermon, but, you know, this book that I'm writing, you know, is about something I deeply resent, transmisogyny. And it's part of an exercise in the care of myself and in my realization as I've arrived at this moment in my career that I am just full of anger all the time, not just, you know, for what I have experienced in my life, but actually for like trying to do the work that I am now actually been given some space and resources to do, and finding that all of the ingredients have been profoundly contaminated by this thing that as of yet still has no, there are no books about trans, I mean, there are actually very few books about misogyny too. Anyway, separate question. But so, you know, what is hope if it's not idealization, right? Like what do we do if it's not, you know, calling on our ancestors as if they were the same as us, right? You know, my favorite thing about the work I do historically is that when I look into the past, I don't see myself. And that's humbling, right? But I don't want to see myself because I don't want the future to play out as the past. I don't want to be stuck in the kind of purgatory that that evil angel announced, right? And so in part, I think that when we turn to, there are lineages. They have just been discredited, devalued. Every single material blockage possible has been put in their way to break down the families that trans women, especially poor trans women, especially trans women of color, and especially trans women of color who do sex work, have built. There's a whole repertoire. This is what my other book in progress is about, DIY. It's a whole body of knowledge. It's a lot better than what institutional science can tell you. let me tell you, right? And some of these girls are better surgeons than the really well-paid ones. But you know, what it brings me to, right, is about two things, right? I think, again, it is this message, the message of Miss Destiny for me is that the political struggle is tied to spiritual enrichment, whatever that means for you, right? But that so much of our politics and scholarship and organizing and our lives under administrative states are so deeply secularized. They do not care about the quality of the lives that we live, and they do not respect what is greater in our life than how we appear, how we show up, how we're represented. And I just think that there is a fundamental ineffable thing, a kind of magic that I will always be chasing after. That's not mine to name for you. It's not mine to own. I don't feel, I mean, I love Miss Destiny because she was both real and a fictional character, but so were all of these people. They're not here anymore. I can't go talk to them. And even if I could, their stories don't belong to me, but they mean something to me in that I feel grounded, reinforced, and cared for by the work that they did. And I'm just trying to honor it a little bit, and also to do so as a gesture towards myself and other people